Hey, Know Why listeners, do you remember being a kid and riding your bike or walking over to your neighbor's house and knocking on the door and seeing if they could come out to play? Do you remember a time in the past where you would be outside on your front porch, walking the dog, waving, running over to the neighbor, or sending your kids over to the neighbor to ask if they had an egg or a tablespoon of something that you needed for dinner? These are the kinds of interactions that have shaped American communities for decades, even centuries, and yet fewer people are talking to their neighbors than ever before. So why is that? That's what I want to get into in this episode of the Know Why podcast. I love this topic because it is summertime. A lot of people, especially with younger families, they are more free. They're out and about more because school's out, and it'd be a great time to connect with neighbors. And as we've discussed multiple times on the Know Why podcast, there's a loneliness epidemic going on. Mental health is poor, especially among young people. And people really need each other in order to thrive in relationships. But anyways, let's talk about neighbors and neighborhoods and why it is we aren't really connecting with our neighbors like we used to. And let's also look at what factors enable people to connect with their neighbors more. So you are not crazy for thinking that people aren't talking to their neighbors very much. In fact, the American Enterprise Institute recently published some research, and here's what they found. The percentages of Americans who are talking to their neighbors at least a few times a week are 40% overall. Oh, only 40% of Americans say that they talk to their neighbors a few times a week. Now, when you talk about older Americans, meaning 65 plus, they are talking to their neighbors quite a bit more. 56% say that they are talking to their neighbors at least a few times a week. But younger Americans is way less. Americans ages 18 to 29, just 25% of them say that they talk to their neighbors a few times a week. Now, when you compare those numbers to 2012, so just 14 years ago, 59%, almost 60% of all Americans said they talk to their neighbors. Definitely a strong majority, including 63% of older Americans and 51% of younger Americans, still over half, talk to their neighbors. The research presented by AEI offers several explanations and details, and one of them that we do have to acknowledge because it's hard to ignore is a class difference. So college-educated Americans are more likely to spend more time talking with their neighbors than Americans who don't have a college degree. They're also more comfortable asking their neighbors for help. So what's interesting is mothers with a college degree are more likely to be willing to ask their neighbor for help with childcare in an emergency versus women who do not have a childcare or do not have a college degree. What's interesting, though, is that across class differences, men are more comfortable asking neighbors for last-minute help like that than women are. I think that's probably because mothers have mama bear instinct a lot of times. But if you don't know your neighbors and you don't talk with them as much, then it makes sense that you wouldn't be comfortable leaving your children with them in case of an emergency. So here's what AEI has to say, just to kind of sum it up. Americans with less formal education have experienced the sharpest decline in neighborhood social experiences. They have fewer social outlets and are less able to rely on neighbors for critical support. Only about 1 in 3 non-college mothers feel comfortable relying on a neighbor to watch their child in an emergency. Why is that? They go on to say, well, maybe it's because of a lack of access to social infrastructures that foster conversation and community with neighbors, like amenities such as coffee shops and public parks and community centers, these things that provide what they call a third space. So one thing I did want to note, though, with the class divide is that when it comes to an example of these kinds of third spaces, public libraries, there is actually less disparity between more formal education and less formal education. So those public amenities are more likely to be accessible to people regardless of class. However, few Americans overall have access to a public library, only 37%. So this part of the conversation is really helpful, especially on a local level. And we've talked about localism in the past. But if you really want to make a difference in your local community, having places that are safe and that are public third spaces where people can hang out and congregate and connect as families or teenagers or even children who are independent enough to be able to go to those places, that is really essential for people to be able to thrive. So something that you can advocate for on a local level is making sure that your town has access to places like that and trying to affect and influence the way that towns are zoned and built out and planned so that even people who maybe aren't in the very top tier neighborhood in the town aren't missing out on those third spaces where they can congregate and then connect with other people. That is super important. And so things like libraries that are free and they're public and open, those things are priceless really when it comes to a third space. But let's move on because there are a few other factors that affect or influence whether or not somebody is likely to talk with their neighbors very often. And one of those things is what people consider a good neighbor to be. So think for a second, what's your definition of a good neighbor? Is it a neighbor who stays quiet? Is it a neighbor who minds their own business and doesn't bother you? Is it a neighbor who is outgoing and friendly? Well, 65% of Americans believe that a good neighbor means not getting too involved in your neighbor's personal affairs. Only 1/3 of Americans, by comparison, believe that being a good neighbor is about rendering help and support, even if unasked. So the proactively helpful neighbor is not necessarily the definition that comes to mind when most people today think of a good neighbor. The I'm staying out of your business neighbor is the definition that comes to mind for most people. And again, we see kind of these generational disparities. Younger Americans, 70% say that the definition of being a good neighbor is staying out of other people's personal affairs. Well, there is another thing that influences how people interact with their neighbors or view neighborliness. Religious Americans tend to have different conceptions of neighborliness. Close to half, 45%, of Americans who attend religious services multiple times a week say being a good neighbor requires engaging with the people who live around you, even if they do not request it. I'm reading from the AEI report here. Only 52% of Americans who attend religious services more than once a week say keeping your distance from others is what makes a good neighbor. A view shared by nearly 3/4, 73% of those who never attend services. So the vast majority of people who do not attend religious services at all are likely to believe that being a good neighbor means minding your own business. But Americans who frequently attend religious services, which is typically an indicator of one being very devoted to their faith and very religious, they're more likely to take the view that being a good neighbor means being proactively helpful. This reminds me of a parable that Jesus told about the Good Samaritan, because he is being asked in this story, who is my neighbor? Because he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. He said those are the two greatest commandments, that the whole law of the Old Testament is basically summed up in those two laws, those two commands, to love God and love your neighbor. And of course, people are trying to figure out what are the limits of this. So they're like, well, who's my neighbor? And people even ask that today, don't we? With a lot of the political conversations and the hostility and the partisanship and the divides between people. Who is my neighbor really? Is it the immigrant? Is it the legal immigrant only? Is it the person who votes way differently than I do? Is it the person that sits beside me in church? Who is my neighbor? So to answer, Jesus doesn't give a straight answer, of course. He tells a story about the Good Samaritan. And even if you weren't raised in church or attended very much, you've probably heard about the Good Samaritan. Well, what happened was a Jewish man was robbed and beaten on the road by robbers, and he was left for dead. And multiple people walk by, including religious leaders and other prominent people, and they go to the other side of the road to avoid this man who was laying beaten and dying on the side of the road. But it was a Samaritan who stopped, checked on him, took care of him, took him to an inn, paid for him to stay where he could recover. Now, why does this matter? What's a Samaritan? Basically, what you need to know to get the gist and the meaning of the story is that in those times in which Jesus was speaking, Jews and Samaritans did not like each other. They were two people groups who were hostile. And so Jesus was saying the person that is the other, who you do not like, you do not necessarily accept in your culture, that's the good neighbor. Why? Because he didn't just say, well, I don't want to get involved in their personal affairs. He went out of his way to be helpful. I just think that that's a really appropriate parable for this topic and for our times. But moving on, religious Americans are also more likely to have communication with their neighbors. Well, that's not a surprise, especially if they are more likely to think that that's part of what being a good neighbor is being proactively helpful and involved. So here's a big difference. Remember how younger Americans are less likely, like way less likely, to have even talked with their neighbors that week, or to think that being helpful is the definition of being a good neighbor. Well, there's a big difference that shows up when that young person is religious. Here's a quote. Americans age 18 to 29 who attend religious services weekly or more are twice as likely as those who seldom or never attend to have weekly conversations with their neighbors, 40% versus 20%. So when you look at the group of Americans who are least likely to interact with their neighbors at all, which are the younger Americans, that percentage doubles if those younger Americans are religious. So you really see that religious belief is a huge predictor in whether or not someone's going to be involved with their neighbors at all. So interacting with their neighbors includes getting together to solve community problems, socializing, being more physically active. So when you are talking about people who are more likely to talk with their neighbors every week, people who walk with or without a dog. Actually, having a dog is a predictor of interacting with your neighbors more if you walk that dog outside. So, which is kind of a no-brainer. But religious people are more likely to engage in these kinds of activities of being outside, walking around their neighborhoods, spending time at third spaces. Okay, so that is important. And it's just interesting to note that religious belief and activity really does play a big part in motivating people to do that. So before I wrap it up, let's say that you're listening to all of this and you say, look, I do see the need for people to be more engaged with their neighbors and communities. I mean, there's so many aspects of this. There's aspect of raising families, of having the village, of just general well-being, because you're less likely to even develop deep friendships, the kind that you need if you aren't even talking with the people around you at all. People feeling so isolated and polarized politically, spending more time on phones and digital quote-unquote communities versus in-person communities. All these reasons where it would be helpful if people in general were interacting with their physical neighbors more often. But it can be hard, and I'm the first one to say this because I am a natural introvert. I tend to be a little bit shy, and I really sometimes struggle to go out of my way to interact with people who are around me. But I think it's important. And so this is from the Wall Street Journal. And of course, I'll link all of these articles. But it makes a great point that social connection isn't something that just happens to us. We have to make the choice, but it might be easier than you think. So this is an article from Nicholas Epley. He is a professor of behavioral sciences at the University of Chicago, and he's an author, and he wrote this article about some experiments that he's done. So get this. This is really interesting that most people actually mistakenly have negative predictions about what will happen if they start talking to a stranger. He calls it being overly pessimistic, okay? So or misplaced pessimism is the exact term that he used. He said people have low or even bad expectations of how someone will respond when you strike up a conversation. And he's reached this conclusion after research that includes more than 120 experiments and over 3,000 people. So he's conducted these experiments on buses, on trains, in cabs, places where people tend to be around a lot of other strangers and you can't really control it. So some of these experiments involved asking people ahead of time, do you think you're going to have a better, more pleasant commute if you are talking to a stranger or not? People predicted they would have a better commute if they were not engaged in conversation with the stranger. But then in the experiment, they assigned certain people to have conversations and certain people to stay to themselves. Well, the people who ended up having conversations with the stranger reported higher enjoyment on their commute. So basically what he said is people realized and found that when they were pessimistic about, oh, that person doesn't want to talk to me, the conversation's not going to go well, it's going to be awkward, if they just struck up a conversation, then they ended up being surprised and actually enjoying it and found that people did want to talk. And how often have you felt that? Just think about it, where maybe you're standing around and somebody strikes up a conversation with you. Now, yes, we've all been in those times where it's like, hey, I don't want to talk to anybody, but I know there have been plenty of times where I'm perfectly happy to have a conversation. And when somebody starts talking to me or says a compliment or asks a thoughtful question or just makes a comment, then you start engaging. People need that. They need social interaction. And if you are wondering, well, I don't even know how to ask questions, I don't know how to get the ball rolling, I have a resource for you. The Art of Asking Better Questions by J.R. Briggs. Now, this book is awesome because it talks about how we can learn to ask better questions and how that can help us grow in our relationships, in leadership positions, and even in our faith. And the awesome part is that this book has discussion questions. It has multiple examples of different kinds of questions to ask in different contexts. It breaks down different kinds of questions so that you can understand what levels of questions there are and how to ask the right ones. You know what, it would be a great idea? Almost every neighborhood is going to have a Facebook group. So go on the Facebook group, say who'd be interested in starting a book club and who would want to read this book. There are discussion questions in it. Think about what a great way to get conversation going in your neighborhood with your neighbors. And maybe you actually make some friends that are around you. More people are open to doing that kind of thing than we often realize. It just takes somebody to throw it out there and get it started. So that's a recommendation. I'll link this book. I just interviewed the author today on Point of View Radio, and I'll link that interview as well. So just to recap, people aren't talking with their neighbors as much anymore. They're not trusting their neighbors anymore. This is especially true for young people. People tend to think that being a good neighbor means staying out of other people's business. And I think that there is some truth to that. However, you see that in religious communities, it really makes a difference when people think about what a good neighbor is, because they're more likely to be engaging with their neighbors, to be proactively helpful, and go out of their way to try to be a good neighbor. And just think about how much in communities could be better or improved if people actually felt like they could rely on their neighbors for help again. But it requires being intentional and putting yourself out there, but it may not be as awkward as you think. So I'm going to leave it there. I encourage you to try to connect with a neighbor this summer, and I will see you next time